Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I have a distinguished guest this morning, Professor of Law and Director of the New Workplace Institute at Suffolk University Law School in Boston, David Yamada. Welcome, David. We were chatting in Barcelona at the International Academy of Law and Mental Health, and I said, please talk about workplace bullying. It's certainly a topic for the times, with bullying from very high levels within our society right now. I'll just say a few more laudatory things about you, David, before we get going. You're a widely recognized authority on workplace bullying and abuse. You've authored leading law review articles on the topic. You're the primary drafter of a model workplace anti-bullying legislation, which can be used as a template for law reform efforts in the U.S. You're involved in something called therapeutic jurisprudence, which I love and think it's absolutely necessary to bring together psychology and law to make it more humane. You did a blog called Minding the Workplace, a popular source for commentary on workers, and workplaces. And your current work is examining how law, public policy, and dispute resolution procedures can be designed to be more trauma-informed. David Yamada, welcome to the Influence Continuum.
Steve, thank you so much for this invitation. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to since we chatted in Barcelona, and I'm so honored that you would invite me to join you and your audience.
Well, you're a fellow after my own heart, wanting to make the world a better place, wanting to bring laws and protections from abuses. So this is all very relevant to my work.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. I'm seeing, as we talked before, I'm seeing more and more of the intersections between the kinds of work that we're doing. It might not be apparent at first, but you dig a little deeper and then you start to see the connections and similarities. And it's quite enlightening when you have that realization.
Yeah, I can't help but take the opportunity to say Donald Trump is a bully. Really very stereotypical malignant narcissist bully who doesn't have empathy and just berates everybody and treats them as objects. So forgive me for starting out with the cult of Trump, but it's kind of the obvious topic at the moment.
Well, Steve, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I guess I can't claim to put politics aside, but at least trying to put politics aside and looking mainly at behaviors themselves. He comports himself as the classic workplace bully or bully in general. He is abusive, name-calling, ridiculing, consistent with some of the worst types of workplace bullies I've seen, very suggesting, as you and some of your colleagues have had discussions about, of cluster B type behaviors, right? Narcissism, sociopathy, those types of qualities. And he is just an ongoing example of somebody who conducts himself in a very mean-spirited, cruel, and abusive way. It is stunning to me, Steve, that those qualities being so present, nevertheless, have us looking at an election that, at least according to the polls, is still very close. It's disappointing to me that people aren't seeing through what this guy is, because it is so scary when you look at those qualities, on a national and international level. I've, looked at workplace bullying from an organizational standpoint and seen how destructive these kind of behaviors can be. But then you project it on a scale of national and international significance, and the fears that people have of a second Trump presidency, in my opinion, are very well taken. And so I think you're bringing him up at the beginning of our conversation is an appropriate topic for discussion. Definitely.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll comment that I think it's 40 out of 44 former insiders at the Trump White House have now come out in favor of Kamala Harris and said,
Yes.
we don't think Trump should have this power ever again.
Yeah, and a lot of those folks, to their credit, are putting on the shelf for now significant policy differences with the Democratic nominee, because they see a bigger threat to our democracy, and they're willing to support someone whom they probably have a lot of substantive disagreements with, but at least they respect the fact that she stands for, the preservation, literally, of democratic, governance. And so I find myself very appreciative of those folks. And, this election, a dear friend and colleague of mine named Gary Namey, who founded an organization called the Workplace Bullying Institute, is very fond of using the term psychologize to describe some of the work that I've been doing in the realm of employment law and law generally. And I'm going to take that term and suggest that we really have to apply the notion of psychologizing and understanding of our politics and civic life, because I look at the work that you've done, right? Your book is sitting right behind us or right behind you, and stands as, a symbol, a tangible symbol of applying some of the real insights you've had on cult behavior to the Trump phenomenon. I saw you be interviewed by Ruth Ben-Gia. And Ruth takes an approach looking at it from an authoritarian standpoint. You brought in Bandy X. Lee a couple days ago, to talk about really the pure psychiatry and psychology of Trump and why he sets off alarms to people who are well versed, in that sort of clinical discipline. And so what you see is this intersection of different perspectives that's, ringing alarm bells about the psychological baggage of this guy, very damaged individual, and how it translates into harm for the rest of society. And so, I don't want to reduce all politics to, just being the products of all of our respective baggage, right? But in this case, it's significant. And also, to look to the Democratic side, right? President Biden, there were a lot of questions about his cognitive capacities. And so once again, we've had to psychologize that part of, looking at the campaign to say, well, is President Biden, ready for the rigors of a national campaign, especially in a race this close? And well, for various reasons, he decided to step down. And now we have a different situation. But again, the psychological insights were very much part of that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So all I can say is, it was Bandy Lee, actually, forensic psychiatrist and expert on dangerousness, who edited The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, told me, think about it, Steve. If you're on a nuclear submarine, you need to be evaluated yearly to see whether you're fit to even be anywhere close to a nuclear arsenal. And then we have the commander-in-chief with the football, and there's no need to evaluate somebody's sanity and stability. And there's something wrong with this connection, I think.
Yeah. So how deep do we take it? And on the other end of that spectrum, or I guess to raise some counter concerns, how do we ensure that sort of false accusations of mental incapacity aren't sort of weaponized to just kind of be shooting at each other, right? What's the balance here? Now, I would suggest still that the balance is that we haven't fully incorporated a lot of these insights into understanding how some of our leaders act. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want, I don't know, non-clinically trained, untrained people like me to be, pushing my diagnoses all the time, even though with Trump, it does seem sometimes kind of obvious,
Yeah.
on
So
occasion.
again, quoting Dr. Lee, she said there should be a bipartisan panel
Yes.
to evaluate anyone who's in around nuclear weapons and powers and state secrets. And she feels, and I feel, that the American Psychiatric Association overstepped by censoring her and
Yeah.
other mental health professionals, saying it's the Goldwater rule, you can't diagnose. To which she says, and I say, we have a duty to warn. We're not diagnosing. But especially for Bandy, who's an expert on dangerousness, she rarely meets the people that she has to evaluate, but she looks at behaviors. And she quotes the famous Donald Trump line, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and kill someone and my followers will still follow me. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
That's kind of dangerous indicator.
Yeah. And, the thing with Trump is that now that we're talking about his psychological state, it's easier to understand why so many people who have experienced trauma, experienced abuse, find their buttons pushed by this guy. They might not always be able to explain why, but there's a visceral reaction because for some people it reminds them of partners they've had, bosses they've had, people in their lives who've they've intersected with over the years. And it's really something when so many people just hear this guy's voice and find themselves triggered by it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And, I wanted to pick up on something you're talking about with Bandy Lee. When we talk about perhaps at least trying to evaluate the psychological fitness of some of our elected officials, I found a similar dynamic occurs in workplaces, right? Because you have in some workplaces, not all, thank goodness, but um, CEOs who take sort of a Trumpian type of approach to running their businesses. You also have some other executives, mid-level managers, who may be treating workers in a less than ideal way. Um, I have always believed in the work that I've been doing from a law and public policy standpoint, that in terms of trying to advocate for protections against workplace bullying, which unfortunately in the United States do not exist, that we really have to be looking at that kind of narrower bandwidth of really severe types of workplace mistreatment that, at least anecdotally, because we don't get to do a survey on this stuff, but at least anecdotally seem to be driven by the same types of personality issues. Or could we say, personality abnormalities, looking at the DSM and looking at, narcissistic behavior, antisocial personality disorder, and so forth. And one of the things that we're not able to do is to say, hey, boss, you're exhibiting some behaviors that are very disturbing. Have you ever have you ever been checked out, psychiatrically? Because we do know that there is some correlation between so-called psychopathic behaviors and the higher up you go on the organizational chart. There is something about that power that is very seductive to some folks, and especially when it comes to power over other people. And we've seen that generically in organizational settings. And, not every instance of bullying is due to someone who, ticks off all the boxes, in terms of psychopathy or sociopathy or even severe narcissism. But oftentimes those traits are very present and they make people's lives miserable. And they also empower others to act that way. Just as we've seen Donald Trump empower a lot of other people to act in some just really cruel and mean-spirited ways. A lot of the incivility in this country, I think, we can start to trace back to like 2015, 2016. The same things happen in our workplaces, right? The culture is established, on top. And I regret that I have to say that, because my introduction to workplace issues started when I became a shop steward as a legal aid lawyer, right? And always believed in, and still believe, in the power of the people. But when it comes to organizational culture, if the message from on top is a positive one, I think people will end up having better, more productive work experiences. But when it's an abusive one, that trickles down as well, and people suffer, and oftentimes productivity falls as well.
I was going to say the bottom line suffers typically if people are not motivated and don't feel like they're part of a cause, that where their work matters.
Yes, and we've seen instances where even that question of the impact of bullying on productivity gets ignored, because when somebody is acting in a way that suggests some personality disorder, now I'm going to sort of cross into your realm, the behaviors themselves aren't always logical or rational, right?
Right.
Somebody can take an extreme dislike of someone for reasons that have nothing to do with the bottom line or that person's productivity, or sometimes are even threatened by that person's productivity, right?
Right.
And then they go after them. And whether it's through overt or covert means, the overt stuff being sort of the yelling and screaming boss, the covert stuff being, behind the back sabotage and defamation and things like that, that oftentimes the real intention, even if it's not announced, is to drive someone out of the workplace, and oftentimes to really even drive them out of a livelihood or a vocation or career. And in those worst instances of bullying at work, that often has been the consequence. And I raised that sort of standard brand illustration as saying it's reflective of kind of an eliminationist instinct, right?
Mm.
In this case, it's elimination of someone's job and their livelihood, and to basically make them invisible in that organization, right? They're
Right.
They disappear. And I was thinking about how that relates to your work on cult behavior. And interestingly, if the bullying is designed to push people out, the cult behavior is designed to pull people in and keep them in. But the eliminationist piece is in their individuality, because if they're not willing to play by the rules of that cult community, then they too are not going to be favorably treated. And oftentimes, you've got very similar types of personalities engaging in bullying, severe bullying, the targeted bullying that I was talking about, and cult creation. So, more and more as I thought about it, yeah, on the surface, okay, workplace bullying or bullying in general, cult behavior, are there overlaps? And I started to think, wow, when you start from a place of targeted abuse, manipulation, and exploitation, you do start to see similarities, even if they're not glaring at us. They have to be sort of thought through a little bit.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to jump on and just share. My influence continuum is a continuum. It's not an all or nothing. And the extreme cult stuff is literally a programmed identity that's a clone of the cult leader, where you're shut down from your own conscience, your own feelings, your sources of information, etc. So I think the workplace bullying is more in this dimension on the influence continuum, destructive, but not as extreme.
Exactly.
But what I wanted to ask you is, so I'd like to hear some of your policy thoughts. Like, what can we do in the workplace to make it a better environment and protect people from these abuses?
Okay. Well, first, it's a really big question in a way, because when it comes to workplace bullying, although other countries have used some of their mostly through workplace safety and health laws. They've enacted
Mm-hmm.
some ordinances and regulations to address this type of sort of generic harassment at work. In the United States, unless the harassment or the bullying is based on somebody's protected class status, such as sexual harassment, racial harassment, disability harassment, that type of protected class, absent that type of discriminatory motivation, the behavior is largely legal. So if somebody just takes an extreme dislike of someone, maybe they're very threatened by an underling who happens to be very good at their job, poses a threat, maybe is popular with their coworkers, so there's some resentment there. And then the bully, who may very well possess some of these, at least, resembling some of the DSM characteristics that we become familiar with, decides to go after them and thinks, well, I'm going to just sort of drive them out of the workplace, and engages in these types of behaviors. And so there you do have, I agree, it's not quite on the level or the severity on the scale of cult behavior, but it is very controlling. In the United States, especially, and this is an interesting point. I don't know how it sounds to you from a cult behavior standpoint, but in the U.S., bullying in the workplace tends to be a top-down phenomenon. Much more bullying goes from supervisor or manager to subordinate than from peer to peer, and only a small percentage of bullying is bottom up from the subordinate to
Good point.
the manager.
Yeah.
So our bullying at work tends to reflect the hierarchical notions that we have in our workplace, especially in a country where you have one of the lowest unionization levels, and where the workplace protections tend to be more limited than some of the other nations. So, as I said, to return to my original point there on the law, generic workplace bullying is legal in the U.S. I've drafted this model statute called the Healthy Workplace Bill, which creates a legal cause of action for an individual who can show that they have been severely bullied and experienced some type of health harm, physical or mental or both. It also builds in some legal incentives for employers to act preventively and responsively. In other words, they can reduce their liability exposure by instituting policies, engaging in employee training on workplace bullying, and also having policies for reporting that they hopefully would actually follow, right? And so the Healthy Workplace Bill sort of tracks the kind of approach that Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court have taken when it comes to addressing sexual harassment at work through Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. But instead of saying that only harassment and mistreatment based on protected class status is an unlawful employment practice, we're going to make any kind of really targeted harassment that is health harming an unlawful employment practice. And that's sort of how I've set this up. And it's also drawing a line at a fairly severe level of behavior, because I also have a sort of an accompanying fear that if you set the legal bar too low, you open up the door to the law being used for basically, food fights between employees who are just slapping each other with complaints because they're not getting along, or even in ways that the bullies can claim that they're being abused by their targets, right?
Right.
Instead of the other way around. So, in a nutshell, that's what I've been doing with workplace bullying. We've had some success in getting adaptations of this statute enacted in certain states requiring training and education, but we have yet to find a state willing to bite on creating an actual legal claim for damages for workplace bullying. And the resistance from the corporate sector has been pretty significant. They didn't take us seriously at first, but once we started getting co-sponsors in legislatures, all of a sudden they sat up straight and said, "Oh, we've got to stop this from occurring." And at least for now, they've been effective at doing it. But some of us are very persevering. So
Yep.
someday, yes.
Well, I think with like you, I believe just, psychoeducation, raising the issue, like you explained to me about protected classes, which I had not known or thought systematically about, is vital. I guess I'm also wondering if there are checks and balances that might institutionally be encouraged. What I'm particularly thinking about is, are you familiar with Ira Chaliff's work by any chance?
No, I'm not.
He wrote Intelligent Disobedience and Courageous Followership. He's done trainings in the U.S. military and around the world. And he basically says if there's a defined value mission statement for an organization, that the employees and everybody can have a clarity over why are we doing this work for this company, and the leader is undermining that mission or undermining the productivity to arrive at that solution, that they should be empowered to rise up, be courageous, and speak truth to power, and remind the leader, you want us to make money, you want us to help the environment or whatever the mission is, help us to do our job, or something like that.
Well, one reason why I appreciate these conversations, because it always gives me a chance to jot down somebody else to learn about. So thank you for mentioning that, because I think that's something I definitely want to look at, because what you're describing is what a lot of us would hope our workplaces would become, where just, everyday workers feel empowered and protected enough to responsibly question cultures or behaviors that are counterproductive, right? Our workplaces tend to operate more out of fear, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
Even if somebody has been sexually harassed and therefore does have protections against retaliation for reporting that sexual harassment, a lot of people decide not to because they're fearful of retaliation that the employer may get away with, notwithstanding the existence of protections against that type of whistleblowing behavior.
Right.
And there's, we've in the situations where protections do exist, we somehow have to promote a culture of responsible reporting, right?
Right.
But even where they don't exist, the idea that we should be encouraging workers to have some input, reasonable input on workplace culture, and also on how they're being treated, should be part of the conversation. But we are a very vertical kind of workplace culture as a default place in the United States. And those, types of assumptions don't really exist. We're taught very early that, what's the way to get ahead is to, just, follow what you've been told and to do it and to not make waves. And, generally I'd say there's some wisdom in that, especially if I'm, working a summer job for the first time at age, whatever in my teens. I shouldn't walk in like I'm, the manager or anything. I've got to learn a few things, right? And it helps to develop a work ethic and to be able to, accept instructions and directives and feedback, right? And to process that and improve ourselves. But then there reaches a point where, we've all got our own observations. We've got our own common sense, and we should be able to respond and say, boy, this doesn't feel comfortable. Or I think, this culture feels somewhat threatening. And boy, oh boy, that gets us into the realm of bullying. And it also, I'll just to take it a step further, it gets us into the realm of law, because here's one of the things that triggers potential legal liabilities for employers. So let's say you want to take that culture and put it in your employee handbook. And so you might even have some gentle or more explicit statements that bullying behaviors are not approved in this
Mm-hmm.
workplace. Well, in many states, including Massachusetts, where we're both talking from, employee handbooks can have contractual enforceability. So if an employer has, like, let's say, some type of a dignity statement in their handbook, and includes the equivalent of "thou shalt not bully," and and an employee feels like they're being bullied, they might be able to cite that employee handbook provision as being a violation of their either express or implicit employment contract. And that's why some employers don't want to put something like that in there. They don't want to empower somebody to say, I have a contractual right not to be bullied, right, as part of my employment relationship. If we could even get to that point, I'd be happy, right, where there's a contractual expectation that by the fact that you're employed, you shouldn't, you should have a right not to have your job made so miserable that you can't wait to leave. So some employers are very hesitant to put that kind of legally unnecessary language in their employee handbooks because they don't want to create even an implicit right not to be mistreated in that way, which is kind of sad, but it's the reality of things in this sort of liability, sort of fearful business environment.
Yeah, but so is there such a thing? I suspect there is, because you're a law professor, a model employee handbook that is recommended what language should be in there in terms of this. Because then we could then talk about making tax incentives for companies to have an employee handbook and just to attract people who maybe had a bad experience at some
Yeah.
company that wants to find a healthy, safe place to work.
Well, Steve, you and I would be on the same page, right, if we were asked about this stuff. But the sort of the mentality of the standard management side employment lawyer is to minimize legal exposure, and that would include not including in an employee handbook any type of provision that could create even an implicit right that isn't required under law. So obviously, employers are obliged to follow anti-discrimination law, right? And
Right.
some might be subject to different whistleblowing provisions on ethics and things like that. But the standard brand advice coming from many management side employment lawyers would be, don't go beyond what the law requires you to do, even though if from an organizational behavior and an organizational psychology standpoint, you might put in a provision that sends a message to people that they are welcomed here. And we want to get the best out of you by treating you with, a baseline of respect and dignity. And one thing I've found over the years, as I've been in this world of workplace bullying, abuse and mobbing and all these, sort of along the scale, right? Going from incivility to, really targeted bullying and mobbing behaviors, is that the organizational psychology people are way ahead of the lawyers on this. And even some of the human resources people are way ahead of the lawyers on this. The lawyers are like, nope, 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 nope. At least the management side lawyers are about, we don't want to create lines of liability here or liability exposure. And we haven't had the breakthroughs we need to get some of these protections written into law yet. So there's just a disconnection that occurs when anything that could create a new legal right is put on the table. And disconnection meaning that even if that implicit right relates to behavior that is terribly destructive, terribly injurious to morale and productivity, we don't want it in there. And that's a real shame.
So you've got my neurons percolating, David. And for example, I'm thinking like Adam Grant, who I'm a big fan of, Wharton School of Business, organizational psychologist, to access people who can appeal to the CEO's sense of self and sense of self-identity, that they want to be a good person and run a healthy ship, to use that metaphor, that they might be able to say to the lawyers they pay, I hear you, but people need to feel safe, and they're going to be much more productive. We'll make tons more money if we have an employee handbook and make this explicit. And therefore, I just think there's so many people who've been so burned by being in bad companies that they don't feel safe to get involved. And we're talking really brilliant, talented people, which on one level, societally, they become entrepreneurs because I'd rather be my own boss than have to do that. But as a world and as a society, I think we're missing out on some things that you're trying to address here.
Well, at sort of the meta level, I'd agree with you 100%. And I would actually at least sort of put out there that the CEOs, the board chairs and so forth, who are reading Adam Grant, who are familiar with some of this work that's being done on how to create thriving organizations, are already sort of modeling this behavior, even if they're not sticking it into employee handbooks. And in that sense, it may not be necessary even to have it, sort of explicitly on a piece of paper, because it's being modeled from the top, and the messages are sent that these are the types of mid-level managers that we want to hire, right? Not the tyrants. The problem is, what do you do about that, significant subset where things are dysfunctional, unhealthy, and then we get into the term that's being used so often, toxic, right? We're hearing a lot about toxic workplaces, and I've kind of been on a mission to say, well, okay, we got to get beyond that term, because toxic could mean any one of a million different possibilities, right? Sometimes toxic workplace refers to a site that's rife with sexual harassment. Sometimes it's toxic because there are threatened layoffs and management isn't communicating right. Other times it's bullying type behaviors. But until we get beneath that broad term, we're not really sure what we're dealing with. But in any event, this kind of stuff is significant. The Surgeon General issued a report recently in 2022 that identified toxic workplaces as one of the biggest threats to worker safety, health, and productivity. So we should
include that in the blog. We should put a link to that, because I didn't know that the Surgeon General said anything about this.
There's been a lot of important work being done in the last few years, and I think it's come out of the pandemic in part, of recognizing these, just the sources of counterproductive work situations that are having really, really severe impacts on everyday, public health, right?
Yes.
And that's where we're looking at, right? You've used that term, public health. We're looking at this stuff as a public health hazard. And unfortunately, in some instances, as many people have experienced, the workplace is a public health hazard. So there's another, sort of theme that we bring into the conversation, in addition to things like, trauma-informed perspectives and whatnot. And so I think I don't know if it's a frustration or a feeling that we're on the precipice. Maybe it's both, that we know so much now about how to do things, I'll just say the right way, right? In terms of how to treat people. The healthy way, the decent way, the humane way. And what we have to do is sort of break through those those power resistances to recognizing that this is the better way to go.
Yeah.
And, I mean, like one of the things that I've really been happy for you is that I know how steadfastly you've been raising this theme of how, insights about cult behavior not only apply to the horrific damage that cults do, but they have resonance with other types of abuse situations. And I think it's due to your perseverance, your relentless perseverance, that, I've seen you have these sort of breakthroughs, right? Where there's people now they're saying, oh, wow, we can use this to understand what's happening in our politics, right? We can use this to understand what's happening in our organizations. And hopefully, though, what often comes at the end is the legal reform, because you've written about undue influence, right, in your dissertation, which you suggested that I look at, and I was like, oh yeah, Steve's collecting some good stuff here. And then you're saying, well, how can we look at this? These models of undue influence, which are based on observations and research, and how does that inform how the law should be more protective of people who've been put in these cultish or abusive, types of circles. But it takes a while for the law to come through, especially in recognizing different kinds of abuse, right? And I'll just illustrate again where, something that taught me some lessons. In one of the courses I teach at Suffolk University Law School, I call it the Law and Psychology Lab. One of our guests was Dr. Lenore Walker, who was the first person to really, theorize based out of her practice the battered spouse syndrome. She was really the first clinician to be able to get this evidence, introduced into court when women killed their batterers. But until then, you had, how many hundreds of years of history of women responding really in self-defense.
Right.
But then being charged with murder and sometimes being sentenced for murder for situations that were really their responses to just, months, years, decades of abuse, right?
Right. Exactly.
But it took such a long time for someone to conceptualize that as a legal defense, and then to get courts to agree to adopt it as a form of self-defense. And even that one, there's still more to go. There's so much. In fact, in the New York Times, there was a major article about the next levels that we have to do to protect individuals in abusive domestic relationships, because so many of these women, especially, are still finding themselves facing horrific prison terms because they weren't able to apply some form of self-defense in their legal situation. So that's my long-winded way of saying that, oh yeah, I'm with you on all this stuff. How do we get the legal system to lower those resistances to insights about psychology, right? To accept some of this stuff because it's valid. It's, most of it's research driven as well as anecdotally.
Right. So when I was introduced to Thomas Gutile, one of the co-founders of the program in psychiatry and the law at Harvard Medical School with Harold Burstein and Archie Brodsky, when I was first introduced to them and asked to give a talk about my desire to update the law regarding undue influence, one of the professors there who was in charge of research, Michael Commons, said, the law gets changed by precedent-setting cases or a preponderance of scientific community signing on to something. If you want to change the law, you need to do a PhD and do a quantitative study on your bite model. Qualitative studies will not influence the law. Yeah. And I went, oh, and he said, you need to go to Fielding and you need to do a quantitative study. And if you do that, I'll supervise your research. And I was like, I'm too old. I'm 63. And he said, I'm 77. Do you want to change the law or don't you? And I was like, you got me on that one. And so, but the reason I'm saying that is that when I did my literature review, one of the first things, and I was advised to do the organizational development and change PhD, not the clinical psych one, even though I'm a clinician, because that's about organizations and businesses, and right. One of the first revelations was Edgar Schein. I'm like, I read his 1961 book on Chinese communist brainwashing. He's like the godfather in behavioral. I'm like, I know him. And then I actually sent him, actually his son gave him The Cult of Trump and he loved it. And then I sent my dissertation and he said, I think it's great you're operationalizing the work that we've all been working on for decades. But the point is the science is there.
Yes.
You know, there's so much interest about cults. If you notice all the documentaries coming out and podcasts, there's so many people who are former members who are now speaking up. Oh, it happened to me. Or I was raised in this extremist community, religious or otherwise. So I think we're at a moment, and if Kamala Harris gets elected as the former attorney general who is involved with undue influence with protecting the elderly in California, I don't know. Maybe we're getting to a tipping point where human rights rises to a point where we can, get this work to a higher level.
Well, there lies what I referred to as, both the, I guess, the exasperation and the opportunity, right? When something becomes so obvious to you because of your own work, right? But other folks aren't quite buying into it yet. You see the possibilities, and there's more mainstreaming of your work, for example, right? And that's part of, getting it into that common discussion, to the point where legislators, for example, are more likely to say, oh, yeah, I've been hearing more about that. And certainly your research and your commentary also, like it did with me, inspires me to ask, well, how does this sort of insight on cult behavior relate to other types of organizational settings, and other types of interpersonal interactions, right? Because, as you said, it's on a scale, it's on a continuum. And we're talking about various levels of control and manipulation and exploitation. And that brings me back to that term I used, psychologizing, right? How do we harness these insights in a way where there is research backing it? So we're not, just kind of talking off the top of our heads. And also then, in terms of the operationalizing it, I think one of the challenges that I see is, when it comes to, say, drafting legislation, where do you draw lines? How do you set up definitions? Because there is a lot of inherent imprecision in making psychological judgments, right? And it's on a scale, right? So how do you put that into legislative language? You set the bar too high, and then there's a lot of bad stuff that is still legal. You set it too low, and all of a sudden, again, it becomes sort of a free for all where everyone's claiming to be, mistreated or abused, and we don't want that conversation to basically undermine what we're really trying to get at, which is the targeted bad stuff. Steve, I find it inspirational that you got your doctorate in your 60s, because I'm at that standpoint in my life now where I'm looking at, I've been able to, I probably spent most of the last 20 years more with, especially organizational psychologists and, HR folks and union folks and whatever than with lawyers. And what I've gotten from that satchel full of research and insight is like this, oh my gosh, how do we bring this into the legal profession? How do we put it before legislators? How do we get it before judges who need to be, like trauma informed and, psychologized in their understanding? And so many of these judges have a knee-jerk reaction when there's too much psychology brought into the conversation because it seems sort of too loosey-goosey for them, when in reality, it's reflecting a lot of insight that should be taken into account, as difficult as it might be to apply when trying to hang it around the sort of the scaffolding of a statute or regulation.
Right. Well, you may need to do a PhD, buddy, and write a book,
Well, I'm thinking in big thoughts like that. And again, folks like you are inspiring me to think more broadly about my scholarly steps. A lot of the stuff I've written has been law review articles, heavy on citations and legal sources and stuff like that. But man, oh man, I find myself so inspired in terms of making connections by the work that you and others are doing. It's one reason why I love that International Congress on Law and Mental Health, where we met in Barcelona a few weeks ago, because it's such an interdisciplinary gathering of people whose hearts are in the right places, and in my opinion, whose brains are in the right places as well.
Well, I'm going to invite you to do a journal article with me. Let's do one for law and public policy, or law and mental health.
Yes, there are partnerships to be made here.
Let's do that, because
I would love to do that.
It would be fantastic, and I'd love to learn. We're going to wrap up in 10 minutes or so, but I want to pick your brain, if I may, just to take advantage of a law professor who knows about psychology and undue influence as you do. So we know that there are whistleblower laws that are protecting, the person who, speaks out and then gets punished. But I want you to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on when people are forced to sign binding arbitration agreements, or they're told to sign an entrance form but not given informed consent or encouraged to go over it with a lawyer, or they don't have money to go over it with a lawyer, and they are signing their rights away.
Yes.
Because I'm seeing that in cultic groups that have businesses.
Yes.
And people are like trafficked. But they sign the membership agreement, agreeing to work, as a minister or whatever, but they're selling books or courses to make millions of dollars. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, there's a couple of levels of this. Let's go first to the fact that there are whistleblowing protections for to report some forms of abuse or ethical transgressions, mistreatment, so forth. And yet you still have people who are understandably afraid to blow the whistle, despite the presence of those whistleblower provisions. It remains right now the unfortunate reality that a lot of whistleblowers, despite having those protections on the books, find themselves in not very good shape after they've blown the whistle. They might have been retaliated against. They might have been blackballed from a profession or a vocation. They might have won something as a settlement X number of years down the road. But that can be an exhausting and just really demeaning and even traumatic experience to try to effectuate one's rights as a whistleblower.
And then the gag order thing that often gets put into place, which frustrates the heck out of me.
You have whistleblower laws, which I think on paper offer protections, but as applied are turning out to be considerably less than what we'd like them to be. Then you bring up something else. Let's say somebody reaches the point where they're able to reach a settlement, right? Then there's a non-disclosure agreement tacked on to some of this. Now, we do have a growing number of laws which are prohibiting NDAs, but still there's a whole realm of agreements that are not subjected to any ban on non-disclosure agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another way in which mistreatment, abuse, retaliation is hidden because the stories don't come out, right? And so there's probably, well, not probably, we know there's a lot more retaliation going on than ever hits the news or ever hits our, ordinary conversations. But some of the worst instances are covered up by non-disclosure agreements.
Right.
So that's another area of the law that has to be tackled. And so there are so many ways in which the more powerful party that is able to stick a piece of paper in front of someone and say, sign this as a condition of joining our group, taking this job, whatever, and we sign it and it goes off. An arbitration agreement. Yes, you'll be able to arbitrate your claims, not in a court of law. You can't go to court of law on this, but instead you can arbitrate your claim somewhere in like South America or something, right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but some of these arbitration agreements actually do move the arbitration location out of the country, right?
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, because it's designed to discourage anyone from wanting to arbitrate, right? Now, we know in labor union situations, arbitration can be very useful. Why? Because you have a union rep there for you. The power relationship is easier, is more even keeled, and you have some protections that are built in from labor laws. But if you are an ordinary consumer or a non-union employee and you're subjected to an arbitration agreement to resolve any possible disputes, that is a very one-sided thing because it's presented to you, as you suggested, like if it's at a job, your first day of work, right? Here's some papers to sign, including the arbitration agreement.
Right.
What are you going to do? Negotiate not to have it on your first day of work?
Right.
And it also assumes that you're just thinking, well, it's going to end poorly, so I better negotiate the arbitration clause instead of just saying, okay, I'll never need this. We're just going to sign it and it's going to be a good, stretch of time here working at this place. So the power relationships from institutions to individuals are very much present in all of those situations that you suggest. And that's where we have to be watching out for, really the dignity and well-being of individuals in situations where the power relationships are very uneven.
Right. All I can say is I'm grateful to know you, that there are folks like you and the Therapeutic Jurisprudence organization that's trying to make the law more just and more humane and more psychologically aligned with real values. Tell us a little bit more about therapeutic jurisprudence, please.
So therapeutic jurisprudence is a very unwieldy term to basically say that our laws, legal institutions, legal processes should put some value on outcomes that are psychologically healthy, that are more therapeutic than anti-therapeutic, that affirm human dignity. We're not saying these should be the only priorities. Economics and due process rights and all this kind of stuff come into play. But it's in a way, to use the language I was using before, we're saying, the law should be a little bit more psychologized.
Right.
To take these insights into account, to be more trauma informed, to be to design laws that are intended and hopefully end up in outcomes to affirm dignity, to affirm psychological well-being. And it's a perspective that people are applying to, it originated in areas such as criminal justice, obviously, where there's so much need for that kind of perspective. But now it's branching out into other areas of law. Certainly family law is a big area where you need that. I watched the podcast in which you were talking about, for example, parental alienation with Dr. Bandy Lee. And so there's an area that is really prime for a therapeutic jurisprudence type of perspective. I'm applying those principles to employment law, and it really relates, to my work on workplace bullying and other aspects of employment policy. So it's really like a lens to say, okay, if we're creating new laws, if we're creating new legal institutions or trying to revise them, are we looking at the the psychological benefits or detriments to the parties who are involved in those proceedings. It's just putting that lens in it to say, basically our psychological health matters, right? Our
Yeah.
well-being matters, and that should be a priority for our legal and public policy systems.
Yeah, fantastic. David Yamada is professor of law, director of the New Workplace Institute at Suffolk University Law School in Boston. David, thank you for being you and all your incredible good work. And
Well,
let's collaborate. I really want to do a journal article with you for, to connect the dots with law and mental health. And this seems like a perfect topic.
I think there are going to be more conversations between us, Steve,
Wonderful.
and some projects in collaboration as well. It's been a real pleasure. I so appreciate this invitation.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.